As I mentioned, I'm going for the HNT Gordon Tail Vice. It's this lovely piece of aluminium and brass machining, and this is produced here in Australia by HNT Gordon. Terry Gordon typically makes wooden hand planes, so this is one of the few metal items that they produce, but it's a lovely piece of kit. This is similar to, at least in installation and in some operations, to the Veritas inset vise. Unlike a lot of tail or wagon vices, you need to think about that before you actually glue up your laminations. The last workbench I had required essentially one shorter strip for the vice travel, though in this one it's all built into it. These are a lot easier to install, particularly after the fact, whereas the bench-crafted tail vice or a lot of the other DIY ones, you really need to think about it and get everything together before you start assembling.
The Wood Night is sponsored by I Would Like.
Alright, so that's enough about the vice. We'll get back to that later. Now what do we actually have to do to install them? The instructions are fairly straightforward, and I've just transferred basically those markings onto my workbench. The only difference is the distance from the edge to the center line here. The center line here is where the dogs will meet up, so I wanted it a little bit closer to the edge, so I've gone for 65mm. You can see that there's basically an outside box and then this inside one. The inside one's where the vice will actually fit into, so that will receive a fairly hefty mortise, groove, whatever you want to call it. And around the perimeter you can see a second area, and that is for essentially the cap piece that sits on top of the vice to hide it away. It will be similar to, this is just an offcut, to this, which is, let's say this is 10mm, but we'll go down about 6mm, put the piece in and then just plane it until it's flush. That will cover up this moving portion here, have a slot in it for the brass dog to fall down into. Alright, so we need to use a router or a drill or chisels to get the material out. I'm going to go with the router using an edge guide because that's easiest. I'm going to start with this deeper section first. May not necessarily go all the way to the bottom, but that means that my lines won't get routed off. Then I can come back and do the shallower section.
After the first pass to depth, I could adjust the edge guide's micro adjuster to get me over to the other side. You might have noticed I wasn't routing all the way to the end. That's because if I did, the edge guide and router base wouldn't have any support. I used a handsaw to go along the lines, then could pretty quickly knock out the short leftover section with a chisel. The shallow groove just needed the edges cleaned up with a chisel, as I didn't have a hard stop to work from. The vice has a locating pin on the bottom. To get the exact location, I put the vice into the mortise and gently tapped on it. That left an indent on the wood that I could drill out with a 5mm bit. The vice also has a hole for a screw. Once the locating pin was seated, I marked that hole, drilled a pilot hole, then I could screw it in by hand. For the cap piece, I'm using a piece of off-cut blackwood. I'm not really sure where the off-cut is from, probably something from the bench. With the thickness down, I could cut it to width and length. There needs to be a groove in it for the dog to slide up and down. The instructions call for a 14mm hole, but the closest size I had that wasn't smaller is a 16mm drill bit. I drilled the start and stop holes with the drill press, then took it over to the router table and did 2 passes to get the width. Off camera I pre-drilled and countersunk for some 6 gauge brass screws to hold it down.
So I wasn't too sure going into this how it would look with the contrasting materials. I actually quite like that. If I ever get sick of it, I can always unscrew this and make another cover plate because that's only ever going to be screwed on. All up, it probably took an hour and a half, 2 hours to install. Probably less time if you weren't filming and trying to get the best angles. It feels really nice in hand. The knurled knob is, or textured knob, I don't know if it's knurling, is quite easy to turn. There's very little resistance. It's a 5/8 inch Acme thread, I think. So I don't actually know what the pitch for that is, but I think it's between 5 and 10mm per full rotation that it advances or retracts. As for how well it works, I don't know. We'll have to wait until the next episode when I drill the dog holes and make some bench dogs. Thanks for watching.